Lily had always imagined that her siblings would be part of every significant event in her life. Growing up, the three of them, Lily, Jason, and James, had shared everything from their childhood secrets to family vacations. The three of them were inseparable in their younger years, a tight-knit trio who always looked out for one another. Their parents had often commented on how close they were, joking that nothing would ever come between them. But as they entered adulthood, things slowly started to change. Jason, the oldest, had always been the leader. He was the one who made the big decisions, who took charge during family gatherings, and who often set the tone for their interactions. James, the youngest, was the mischievous one, always with a twinkle in his eye, quick to make jokes, and eager to bring lightness to any situation. And then there was Lily, the middle child, often caught in between the dynamics of her older brother's seriousness and her younger brother's playfulness. As a kid, Lily didn't mind being in the middle. In fact, it gave her a unique perspective on the family. She loved both her brothers equally, but felt as though her role was more subdued, more quiet, more reliable. She didn't mind. She was content. Things started to change after Jason got engaged. The news had come as a surprise to Lily, not because she didn't think Jason would settle down, but because she had no idea it was coming. Jason had always been private about his romantic life, and when he announced that he was marrying his girlfriend of 2 years, Lily was thrilled. She immediately began planning for the wedding, excited to see her brother start this new chapter of his life. They had always been close, so it felt natural to assume that she would be involved in some way. However, as the wedding planning went on, Lily realized that she wasn't as involved as she had imagined. She wasn't asked to help with the details or to take part in any of the decisions. It wasn't a huge deal at first, she told herself. Jason was busy with his fiancée, and the wedding was a big undertaking. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As the big day drew closer, Lily was preparing herself for a simple guest role. She imagined herself sitting in the audience, watching her brother marry the woman he loved, happy to witness such a significant moment in his life. Then the invitation arrived. The envelope was plain, but there was something in the way it was addressed that caught Lily's attention. Her name was written in bold, formal script, but the lack of personalization felt strange. When she opened it, she was hit with a sense of surprise, then disappointment. The invitation was addressed to her, yes, but there was something missing, the warm, familiar touch she had expected. The note inside was brief and impersonal. It simply listed the date, time, and location of the wedding. No mention of her role in it, no acknowledgement of their bond as siblings. Lily wasn't upset by the formal tone. After all, it was a wedding and everyone had to follow the same formalities. But something in the way the invitation was worded made her feel distant from the event. She tried to shake off the feeling, but it lingered. A few days later, Lily went to visit her parents, eager to talk about the wedding plans. She had hoped to discuss the details with them, as they often enjoyed reminiscing about past family events. However, when she arrived at their house, the atmosphere was tense. Her mother was sitting in the kitchen, quietly preparing lunch, while her father sat in the living room, reading a newspaper. "Hi, Mom." "Dad," Lily greeted them, forcing a smile. "How's everything going with Jason's wedding planning?" Her mother looked up from the counter, giving her a tight smile. "It's going well, but you should really talk to Jason about any questions you have. He's the one making all the decisions now." Lily nodded, trying to suppress the unease growing inside her. "Of course," she replied, "but I just thought I'd help out, as his sister. I haven't been asked to do much yet." Her mother's eyes flickered with something. Was it discomfort? She quickly diverted her gaze back to the chopping board. "Well," her mother said, her voice quieter than usual, "it's his choice how involved he wants people to be. It's his wedding." Lily frowned, sensing the underlying tension. She looked over at her father, but he didn't seem to want to engage. He merely adjusted his glasses and turned another page of the newspaper, avoiding her gaze entirely. "I see," Lily said softly, then forced herself to move past the discomfort. "Anyway, I'll be there. I'm really excited to see Jason get married." Her mother nodded vaguely, and that was the end of their conversation about the wedding. Lily left the house feeling more confused than ever. It wasn't like her family to act this way. Her parents, especially her mother, had always been warm and open, but today there had been a coldness that she couldn't explain. She tried to push the feeling away, telling herself she was overreacting, but the thought nagged at her all day. As the weeks went by, Lily continued to receive only surface-level updates about the wedding. Jason and his fiancée seemed to be making all the decisions on their own, and it became clear that Lily was being kept at arm's length. Her brothers had never been the most communicative about their personal lives, but this felt different. They had always shared the big moments with her, and now it felt like she was being shut out. When James got engaged a few months later, Lily tried to remain optimistic. She told herself that perhaps this was just how weddings were and she shouldn't take it personally. But when James's wedding announcement came, it didn't take long for Lily to realize that this exclusion wasn't an isolated incident. James, who had always been more laid back than Jason, had always looked up to his older brother and followed his lead. So when James announced his engagement and subsequent wedding, Lily hoped things would be different. She had hoped that this time she would be included in the planning, that she would have the chance to contribute as his sister. But instead, she received another cold invitation in the mail, a few weeks after the engagement announcement. The envelope was even more impersonal than Jason's. There were no warm messages, no playful lines, just the plain facts: date, time, venue. Nothing more. Feeling the sting of exclusion again, Lily decided to reach out to James. She didn't want to cause drama or make a big deal of it, but she couldn't help feeling hurt. After all, they were family. "Hey, James," Lily texted. "I saw the invitation for the wedding, and I wanted to ask if there was anything I could do to help, or if you needed anything from me." She waited, watching the 3 dots appear and disappear on her phone screen, then finally received a response. "Hey, Lil, appreciate it, but we're keeping things small. It's just the close family, you understand, right?" Lily blinked at the message, her heart sinking. She hadn't expected to be part of the wedding party or anything, but this answer felt distant. "Sure, I get it," she replied, forcing a smile as she typed the words. "Just wanted to be there for you guys." The response came quickly, almost too quickly. "Thanks. I'll see you there." That was it. No further explanation, no effort to engage, just the bare minimum. Lily tried to brush it off, but it was impossible to ignore. She felt as though she were being erased from their lives, like a mere afterthought. These weren't just weddings. These were pivotal moments in her brothers' lives, and she was being left out in a way she never imagined. What hurt most was not the lack of a formal invitation, but the silence that accompanied it. There was no explanation, no apology, no acknowledgement of the bond they had shared growing up. Lily tried to rationalize it, thinking maybe they were overwhelmed with the wedding preparations, but deep down she knew that something wasn't right. She felt betrayed, and yet she knew there was no way to confront them without making things awkward, without seeming like she was overreacting. So she kept her feelings to herself, bottling up the hurt that simmered beneath the surface. But as the weddings neared, the distance between them felt wider than ever, and Lily couldn't help but wonder, had her brothers forgotten the closeness they had once shared? Or was this just how life worked, how things changed as people grew older? Lily didn't know the answer yet, but one thing was certain: something was about to change, and she would be the one to decide what that change would look like. The weeks following James's wedding invitation were filled with a bitter sort of introspection for Lily. She couldn't shake the feeling of being left out, of being cast aside as something less important than the other guests in her brothers' lives. The wound was still fresh, even though she had tried to move past it. Every time she thought about it, her chest tightened, and a sense of betrayal crept over her. She had always been there for Jason and James, and the sudden distance between them felt like an emotional chasm she couldn't bridge. Lily wasn't the type to dwell on negative feelings for long. She liked to think of herself as resilient, someone who could rise above challenges and move on quickly. But this was different. This was family. Her brothers, the people she had shared her entire life with. This wasn't just a falling out over a disagreement or a minor issue. This was exclusion. And it hurt. It wasn't just the lack of an invitation that stung. It was the sudden shift in her relationship with them. Jason had always been the protector, the big brother who took charge, and James was the playful, carefree sibling who made her laugh even in tough times. But now, they seemed distant, almost like strangers. She was no longer a part of their inner circle, no longer included in the small, meaningful moments that once made her feel valued. For a while, she tried to talk herself out of feeling hurt. "It's just a wedding," she would tell herself. "It's not personal. They're just busy with their lives, and things change as people grow older." But the words rang hollow in her mind. The truth was, it was personal. It wasn't about the wedding itself. It was about the way she had been treated, like she was an afterthought, someone who could be easily dismissed. Days turned into weeks, and still no explanation came from either of her brothers. There was no conversation about why she had been left out of their plans, no apology, no attempt to make amends. They both carried on with their respective lives, absorbed in their own worlds, while Lily remained on the sidelines, her attempts to engage them growing more and more futile. And then, one night, as she sat in her apartment, staring blankly at her phone, the idea came to her. At first, it was a passing thought, a fleeting moment of frustration. But the more she turned it over in her mind, the more the idea began to take shape. If Jason and James could exclude her from their weddings without any explanation, then why shouldn't she do the same? Why shouldn't she show them what it felt like to be left out, to be cast aside as though you didn't matter? She wasn't sure if it was the healthiest way to deal with the situation, but the idea felt almost satisfying. It was as if she had been given an opportunity to put the tables back where they belonged, to show them the impact of their actions. It wasn't about being petty. It was about making them understand what it felt like to be invisible. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that this wasn't just about the weddings. It was about standing up for herself, about reclaiming her sense of self-worth. She had spent so many years trying to please her brothers, trying to fit into their world, but now, for the first time, she was going to make the rules. She wasn't going to chase after their approval. She wasn't going to beg for a seat at the table. Instead, she was going to make them feel the same isolation she had felt. Lily wasn't impulsive. She didn't act on every passing whim, and she certainly wasn't the type to play games. But this wasn't a game. This was a lesson in boundaries, in self-respect, in asserting her own value. She wasn't going to let her brothers continue to treat her like an afterthought. She had tried to reach out. She had made the effort. Now it was their turn. It wasn't long before Lily's plan started to take form. She had been seeing Ethan for a little over a year now, and things were going well. They had talked about the future, about possibly getting married one day, but they hadn't really set any concrete plans yet. But suddenly, Lily felt a sense of urgency. She needed to act quickly. She wasn't going to wait for an invitation to her own life. If her brothers could exclude her from their celebrations, then she could do the same. She would take control of her own narrative. She would create the event that they couldn't ignore, and she would make them realize the cost of leaving her out. The first step was to talk to Ethan. She needed to be sure that he was on board with the idea. It wasn't just about her own feelings, it was about their relationship too. Ethan had always been supportive, but she wanted to make sure he understood why she was doing this. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Lily broached the subject. She was nervous, unsure of how Ethan would react, but as soon as she explained her reasoning, he nodded thoughtfully. "I get it, Lily," Ethan said, his voice calm and understanding. "I think it's important that you do what feels right for you. I can't imagine how hurt you must be, but I also think it's time for you to stand up for yourself. If this is something you need to do, then I'm with you." His words gave her a sense of relief. she wasn't alone in this. Ethan was by her side, and together they could move forward. Over the next few days, Lily started making preparations. She wasn't going to make a huge spectacle of the event, but it was going to be meaningful. It wasn't about showing off or being flashy. It was about creating something that was authentic to her and Ethan. Something that would symbolize her strength and her resolve. She picked a small, intimate venue in the countryside. It was peaceful, secluded, and perfect for a low-key celebration. She didn't need a huge wedding or a massive guest list. What mattered was that it would be a moment that she could cherish. A moment that wouldn't be overshadowed by her brother's exclusion of her. The next step was the invitations. This part was delicate. She didn't want to be vindictive, but she knew she needed to make a statement. She made the decision to exclude Jason and James from the guest list entirely. It wasn't done out of malice. It was a direct reflection of how they had treated her. She couldn't pretend that everything was fine. She couldn't invite them out of obligation when they hadn't bothered to include her. As she finalized the guest list, she felt a strange mixture of emotions. There was guilt, of course. Guilt for excluding her brothers, even though they had done the same to her. But there was also a sense of empowerment, of reclaiming control. She wasn't going to sit idly by while they made decisions that affected her. She wasn't going to let them continue to dictate the terms of her relationship with them. Lily carefully selected the people who had always been there for her, the friends who had supported her through thick and thin, the relatives who had treated her with kindness and respect. These were the people she wanted to celebrate with, not the ones who had excluded her. Once the invitations were sent, Lily felt a strange calm wash over her. She had taken the first step. She had made her decision. Now, it was time to wait. But she didn't feel anxious as she thought she would. Instead, she felt a sense of satisfaction. She had done what she needed to do. She had taken a stand for herself, and that was all that mattered. In the weeks that followed, Jason and James reached out, not yet realizing what had happened. The tension in the air was palpable, but Lily didn't back down. She wasn't going to soften the message. She had made her point, and now it was up to them to understand the consequences of their actions. As the wedding day drew nearer, Lily found herself both nervous and excited. She wasn't sure how her brothers would react, or if they would even show up at all. But one thing was certain. She wasn't going to let their actions define her. She had finally taken control of her own story. The first few days after Lily had made her decision were filled with a strange sense of purpose. She felt as though she had taken back control of her life, but at the same time she couldn't help but wonder how it would all play out. She had never been one to create drama, to stir the pot or make waves. It wasn't her style. But something about the way her brothers had treated her, something about the coldness, the distance, the quiet disregard, had ignited something deep inside of her. She wasn't going to continue to let herself be sidelined, to let them dictate the terms of their relationship with her. Now that the decision had been made, Lily focused all her energy on making the wedding an occasion that would reflect her values, her relationships, and her desire to build something real. She wanted this day to be meaningful. She and Ethan, her fiancé, had decided early on that their wedding wouldn't be about putting on a show for anyone else. It wasn't about impressing people or following traditions just because they were expected. It was about creating a day that felt right for the two of them, surrounded by those who had supported them, and letting that be enough. Ethan, understanding Lily's need for authenticity, was all in. He had never liked the idea of forced family dynamics, especially those that left people feeling unwanted or unloved. His support made Lily feel validated in her decision to keep her brothers out of the event. Even though he didn't know the full extent of the history between them, he understood that Lily needed to stand firm. With the guest list settled, the next step was the invitations. Lily worked meticulously on every detail. She didn't want them to be overtly dramatic, but they had to carry weight. It wasn't just about the names on the list. The very act of deciding who was invited and who wasn't had a profound impact on her, and she couldn't help but feel a little bit of nervous excitement as she prepared to send them out. The invitations she sent to her friends, her extended family, and the people she trusted were warm and personal. Each one felt like a symbol of all the love and support she had received throughout her life. These were the people who had always shown up for her, no matter the occasion. These were the people who had made her feel valued, seen, and understood. She made sure to include a personal touch, whether it was a handwritten note or a small detail that reflected the significance of their relationship. When it came to Jason and James, however, Lily knew she couldn't do the same. They weren't just distant from her. They had actively chosen to exclude her from their most important moments. It wasn't enough to simply leave them off the guest list. Lily needed them to know why. This was not an act of petty vengeance. It was about accountability. She wasn't going to sit silently by while they acted as if her absence didn't matter. They had hurt her, and now it was their turn to feel the sting of exclusion. The wording of their invitations was simple but deliberate. She wrote a brief note explaining that, after careful thought, she had decided to keep her wedding small and intimate, only inviting those closest to her. There was no malice in her tone, only a quiet firmness. She didn't want to accuse them outright, but she made it clear that this decision was born out of her need to surround herself with people who had shown her love, respect, and support throughout her life. She hoped they would understand her choice. When she sealed the envelopes, Lily felt a sense of calm. This was the right thing to do. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't second-guessing herself. She wasn't worried about how it might make her brothers feel. She had done everything she could to reach out to them. Now it was time for them to reckon with their choices. Ethan, as always, was supportive. "You're doing the right thing, Lily," he reassured her when she showed him the final drafts. "They'll get it. It's not about the wedding, it's about the relationship. They need to see that their actions have consequences." A few days later, the invitations were sent out and the waiting began. Lily spent the next few days distracted by the details of her wedding planning, focusing on the flowers, the catering, and the music. She wanted the day to be beautiful, not just for herself, but for Ethan, too. Their relationship had grown stronger and deeper over the years, and this wedding was a celebration of their commitment to each other. But as the days passed, Lily couldn't avoid the nagging sense of anticipation. She kept wondering if Jason and James would even respond. Would they show up, perhaps apologetic but embarrassed by her decision? Or would they ignore it altogether, pretending that nothing had happened, as if everything were just fine? Lily had no way of knowing. She told herself that she wasn't going to focus on them, that her day would be complete with or without them. But deep down, she knew that this was a moment of reckoning for all of them. The way they reacted would tell her everything she needed to know about their respect for her and their understanding of the emotional distance they had created. Several weeks passed before she received the first response, an email from Jason. She opened it, holding her breath for a moment, unsure of what to expect. "Lily," the message began, "I just got your invitation. I'm sorry, but I have to say I'm really surprised. We never meant to hurt you, and I thought we were fine. I'm honestly confused by this. I thought we were good, but it looks like I've misunderstood. We've been busy with wedding planning, and I thought we were keeping it small for everyone's sake. I can't pretend that I don't feel hurt by this, but I respect your decision." Lily felt a mixture of relief and frustration as she read the email. There it was, the familiar tone of Jason's defensiveness, the passive-aggressive undercurrent that seemed to suggest he was hurt by her actions. But there was no acknowledgement of the harm he had caused her, no apology, no attempt to understand how she had felt when she was excluded from his wedding. Instead, he made it seem like she was the one in the wrong for having boundaries. Still, Lily remained calm. She didn't want to engage in a long back and forth with him. She had made her choice, and now it was time to move forward. She responded simply, "I understand that you're confused, Jason, but this is how I feel. I've made my decision. I'm not asking for anything from you. I just wanted to be clear about why I'm doing this. I hope one day you'll understand." That was all she said. She didn't need to explain herself further. She had made her point. If Jason couldn't see why she felt the way she did, then there was nothing more to say. James's response came shortly after. Unlike Jason, he didn't write a long email. Instead, he texted her, "Hey, I saw the invite. Just wanted to say, I'm really hurt by this. We're family, and I don't understand why you would do this to me. I get that you're upset, but I don't think this is the way to handle it." Lily read the text several times, trying to keep her emotions in check. James's response felt different than Jason's. It wasn't as cold, but it was still dismissive in its own way. There was no recognition of the fact that he had treated her the same way Jason had, no acknowledgement of the hurt he had caused. Instead, he seemed to be blaming her for the fallout. Once again, Lily didn't respond immediately. She thought carefully about what to say. After a few hours, she wrote back, "James, I never wanted to hurt you, but I had to make a decision that was best for me. I can't keep allowing myself to be treated like an afterthought. This is my wedding, and I'm doing what feels right for me. I'm sorry if that's hard for you to understand, but I hope one day you will." She sent the message and then sat back, exhaling slowly. She had done what she needed to do. There was nothing more to say. If her brothers couldn't understand why she had made this decision, then there was little she could do to make them see it. This was a boundary she had set, and she wasn't going to apologize for it. In the days that followed, there was no further communication from Jason or James. Neither of them tried to contact her, nor did they try to engage in any further conversations. Lily knew they were processing their feelings, and while part of her wished they would come to her with open hearts, she knew that this was part of the process. They had to sit with the discomfort of the situation. And Lily? She felt more certain of her decision than ever. She was going to walk down that aisle with the people who mattered, with the ones who had always shown up for her. She wasn't going to let her brother's decisions define her day, or her life. Her wedding was her choice, and it was going to be beautiful. As the days until the wedding grew shorter, Lily's anticipation built. This day wasn't just about celebrating her love for Ethan. It was about reclaiming her space, setting her boundaries, and showing herself the respect she deserved. She had stood up for herself, and she was ready to celebrate the life she had built, regardless of whether her brothers understood. The weeks leading up to the wedding were a whirlwind of emotions for Lily. As she had expected, her brothers' responses were cold, distant, and far from apologetic. There were no heartfelt letters, no moments of self-reflection that she had hoped for. Instead, the silence was deafening. Both Jason and James seemed to have made peace with the fact that Lily had excluded them from her celebration, but it was clear they had done so without much understanding of why it happened in the first place. Lily spent her days focusing on the remaining wedding details, picking the perfect flowers, finalizing the seating arrangements, and working with Ethan on making sure everything would run smoothly. As the wedding day drew nearer, the one constant thought in her mind was the question of whether her brothers would show up. Part of her had expected them to make an attempt to repair the relationship, but the longer the silence stretched, the more it became clear that they were either unwilling or unable to face the discomfort of the situation. A few days before the wedding, Lily and Ethan had a quiet dinner together, just the two of them. They discussed the plans, shared excitement about the day ahead, and even laughed about some of the more ridiculous wedding traditions. But underneath the surface, Lily was still wrestling with the weight of her decisions. "Do you think they'll come?" she asked Ethan, taking a slow sip of her wine. Her fingers were still absent-mindedly tracing the rim of her glass as she looked out the window. Ethan paused for a moment, then shook his head slowly. "I don't know, but you have to remember, Lily, they've made their choices. You've given them an opportunity to come to terms with it. You've been clear about how you feel. The rest is up to them." "I know," she murmured, her voice quiet, "but it still hurts, you know? To think they could just brush me off like that. It feels like they've forgotten who I am." Ethan reached over, placing his hand on top of hers. They might have forgotten, but you haven't forgotten yourself. You're doing this for you, not for them. This day is about the life you're building with me, and that's the most important thing. Lily nodded, but a knot remained in her stomach. She couldn't help but feel the absence of her brothers, the family she had grown up with, the people she thought would always be there, no matter what. She had always imagined a different path for them, one where they all continued to support each other through life's ups and downs. Instead, she had been left alone, forced to confront the reality that perhaps her brothers had never truly valued her in the way she had hoped. The night before the wedding, Lily couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts racing. She kept imagining what the day would look like. Walking down the aisle, her friends and family all gathered to celebrate her love with Ethan, surrounded by laughter, joy, and music. It was supposed to be a celebration, but in the back of her mind she couldn't shake the thought of her brothers not being there. In the early morning, she received a message from Jason. It was brief, to the point, and almost impersonal. "I can't make it to the wedding. I'm sorry for everything." That was it. No further explanation, no attempt to make things right. Just a note that seemed to signal a finality, a decision to remain distant, to not even show up. Lily stared at the message for a long time before she responded. There was no anger in her, no vindictive desire to lash out, just a deep, abiding sadness that things had come to this. She typed back, her fingers trembling slightly as she wrote, "I wish you could have been here, Jason, but I understand. I hope one day we can talk." She put the phone down and took a deep breath. It felt final. Jason had made his choice, and in a way that was a relief. She didn't want to chase after someone who wasn't willing to meet her halfway. But the emptiness that lingered after his message stayed with her, and for a moment it was hard to see past it. The next morning, as she prepared for the wedding, Lily tried to push the hurt aside. She dressed in the softest, most delicate fabric she could find, letting herself be enveloped in the beauty of the moment. She had chosen a simple, elegant dress that made her feel radiant, a reflection of the woman she had become, not the girl who had been hurt by the one she loved most. She was stepping into a new chapter of her life, one that didn't include the baggage of her brother's abandonment. Her mother, her closest friends, and a few relatives gathered around her in the small bridal suite, offering words of encouragement and support. But despite their kindness, Lily's mind kept returning to the fact that James still hadn't responded. He hadn't called, texted, or even acknowledged the invitation. It was as if he had slipped into some kind of emotional void, leaving her to wonder if he would show up at all. "Are you ready?" Ethan's voice broke through her thoughts, soft but steady, and she turned to face him as he entered the room. He was dressed in a sharp, tailored suit, his dark eyes filled with warmth. His presence steadied her, and for a moment, the uncertainty of the day melted away. "I think so," Lily said, her voice trembling slightly. I wish they could have been here, both of them." Ethan walked over and gently cupped her face in his hands, his gaze softening as he looked at her. "They've made their choice, Lily. But you're not alone in this. I'm here, and so are all the people who love you. This is your day." Lily nodded, the weight of his words settling over her. The pain wasn't gone, but it was easier to bear. With Ethan by her side, she was reminded of the strength she had inside her. This day was about the love they shared, and that was enough. As the ceremony began, Lily found herself walking down the aisle, her heart pounding in her chest. The venue was breathtaking, a beautiful outdoor garden with flowers blooming all around her, sunlight filtering through the trees, and the air filled with a soft, almost magical energy. She glanced at the guests seated in the rows, her eyes landing on her friends, her mother, and the people who had always been there for her. For a moment, it felt like everything was falling into place, like the pieces of her life were aligning. But as she reached the altar, standing across from Ethan, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing. Her brother's absence was a sharp ache in the back of her mind, a reminder that their rejection had left an indelible James on her heart. She stood tall, determined to move forward, but the absence of the ones she had once shared everything with still loomed large. The ceremony proceeded smoothly. Vows were exchanged, laughter and tears filled the air, and Lily felt a deep sense of peace as she and Ethan were declared husband and wife. It was everything she had hoped for, and more. But in the quiet moments after the ceremony, when they were alone for a few minutes before the reception, Lily felt a pang of longing. She wondered what it would have been like to have Jason and James there, to have them witness the joy of her day, to be part of the celebration. But the truth was clear. They had chosen to stay away. That night, during the reception, as Lily danced with Ethan, she looked out over the crowd. The people who were there for one reason. They loved her, they cared for her, and they wanted to be part of her new chapter. The realization hit her like a wave. She had built a life that was filled with people who valued her, who didn't need to be convinced of her worth. It was a life worth celebrating, with or without her brothers. Just as she was lost in the moment, James appeared. He had slipped into the reception unnoticed, a glass of champagne in his hand, his eyes scanning the room. Lily froze for a moment, her heart racing. This was the moment she had been dreading. Would he apologize? Would he confront her? Would it be a confrontation or an awkward reconciliation? James walked toward her, his face a mixture of uncertainty and regret. When he reached her, he hesitated for a moment, then spoke softly. "Lily, I'm sorry. I messed up. I didn't get it until now. I should have been there for you, and I wasn't. And for that, I'm sorry." Lily's heart swelled as she took a breath, her emotions flooding her. She hadn't expected this, not after everything that had happened, but hearing the sincerity in his voice, the regret in his eyes, softened the pain. "I'm glad you're here, James," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "I don't know if we'll ever go back to the way things were, but this means a lot." They stood there for a moment, a fragile understanding between them, but for the first time in a long while, it felt like a bridge had been built. As the night continued, Lily danced with Ethan, surrounded by the people who mattered. She knew that this chapter of her life was only the beginning, one where she learned to prioritize herself, to set boundaries, and to move forward with grace. And maybe, just maybe, she would be able to rebuild something with her brothers. But for now, she was content. She was at peace.